Picture this for a second. It is a sweltering evening in the mid-1700s, right? You are standing in this grand candlelit ballroom. The air is just thick with the smell of imported perfumes, and there is a string quartet playing the latest European compositions in the background.
Oh, and everyone is dressed to the nines. I mean, men and women in velvet and silk that was literally shipped across the Atlantic Ocean.
Exactly. And they're sipping imported wine, casually discussing, sending their kids over to London for a legal education. It is lavish. It is incredibly refined.
It feels entirely cosmopolitan.
Huh.
Like it's just a displaced slice of the English aristocracy dropped right onto the edge of the North American continent.
Yeah, that is exactly what it is. But then imagine you step outside that ballroom, you get on a horse, and you ride just a few days inland. Suddenly, that whole velvet and silk world just vanishes completely.
Completely gone.
The string quartet is gone. The perfume is gone. Now you are standing in this dense, unforgiving pine forest. There are no ballrooms out here. You are looking at a family dressed in rough, homespun wool, and they are working this tiny patch of rocky dirt just to grow enough food to survive the winter.
Right. Pure survival mode.
Yeah, and they are completely isolated. They are deeply suspicious of outsiders, and frankly, they absolutely despise the people dancing in that ballroom on the coast.
You're looking at the absolute definition of a divided society.
Right.
In two completely alien worlds, operating within the exact same borders, under the exact same colonial banner, and yet they are experiencing entirely different realities.
And that is exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a profoundly detailed historical overview of colonial South Carolina. But our mission today isn't just to recite dates and dusty treaties. We're looking at the daily grind.
The actual human experience.
Right, the hustle, the mechanics of these intense social clashes between the people who actually lived there. We really want to understand how your zip code and your bank account entirely dictated your physical reality, your legal rights, and, your literal chances of survival.
And that is the crucial lens for this deep dive, really. Because when we think of colonial America, we often default to this monolith, right? Like plucky settlers working together to build a new nation.
Right, the whole Thanksgiving aesthetic.
Exactly. But the source material we are looking at paints a mechanically distinct picture. We're going to examine the stark operational contrast between those incredibly wealthy lowcountry planters and the isolated, rugged subsistence of the backcountry farmers. We need to explore how social status dictated literally every single human interaction.
It really is a society built on massive architectural contrasts. Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. Let's set the scene. We are going back to April 1670.
The very start.
Yeah, the initial arrival of European settlers at Albemarle Point, which is right where the Ashley and Cooper rivers meet. They founded a place called Charlestown, obviously named after King Charles II. But the defining characteristic of this settlement, and this is key, is that these were not desperate religious refugees fleeing persecution.
No, not at all. The source notes that these were mostly wealthy English planters, and many of them were actually migrating from the already established English Caribbean colony of Barbados.
Oh, wow. So they weren't starting from scratch.
Right.
Yeah.
They already understood the mechanics of colonial wealth generation. They knew the playbook. And the structure of this new Carolina colony was very specific. In 1663, King Charles II had granted this land to 8 lords proprietors.
Wait, let's make sure we understand exactly what that means because, proprietary colony sounds like a really dry legal term from high school history.
It does, yeah.
But unlike colonies that were directly run by the crown, a proprietary colony was essentially a massive private real estate startup, wasn't it? Like, the king just handed over a chunk of the map to a board of directors.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it, actually. These 8 nobles operated the land strictly for a return on investment. They were looking to build a commercial empire from day one.
Right.
I mean, sure, they wanted to create a bulwark against Spanish Florida to the south, certainly. But their primary directive was to generate staggering wealth. And their initial method for generating that wealth is something that completely upends the traditional narrative we have of the early colonial South.
Yeah, because when we picture early Carolina, I think the immediate assumption is sprawling agricultural plantations, right? Cotton or tobacco.
Right, that's the stereotype.
But the initial economic engine wasn't agriculture at all. It was the Native American trade. And this wasn't just, trading brass kettles for a few beaver pelts.
No, this was an aggressive, large-scale, highly organized commercial operation. They were dealing in deerskins, yes, but far more extensively they were dealing in enslaved Native Americans.
Which is just wild to think about. The sheer volume of this trade was immense, wasn't it?
It was staggering. The early Carolinians exported between 24,000 and 51,000 Native American slaves just from 1670 to 1717.
Wow. 51,000 people.
Yeah. They established these massive trade routes and sent these enslaved individuals to markets all across the hemisphere. I mean, from Boston up in the northern colonies, all the way down to the sugar plantations of Barbados.
And the logistics of capturing and transporting tens of thousands of people across those distances in the late 1600s, I mean, that points to a highly organized network. The English settlers that couldn't have just walked into the woods and done this themselves, right?
No, definitely not. They didn't have the manpower or the geographical knowledge for that.
Yeah.
They had to be utilizing existing geopolitical fractures among the native tribes.
Pitting them against each other.
They absolutely were. The source details how this slave trade adversely affected tribes throughout the entire Southeast by really exacerbating enmity and competition. The English utilized intermediary tribes to do the capturing. A prime example from the text is the Westo.
The Westo, who were they exactly?
They were an Iroquoian people. And to understand them, we have to look slightly north to the Beaver Wars.
Okay.
That was a series of mid-17th century conflicts driven by European fur trade demands and the introduction of firearms. And those wars actually pushed the Westo out of their homeland near Lake Erie.
So the Westos are displaced. They are already heavily armed from their prior northern trade contacts, and they migrate south into the Carolina region.
Precisely. They arrive in South Carolina and basically leverage their military advantage to specialize in capturing and marketing other Native Americans to the white Carolinians.
Wow.
Yeah, they acted as these heavily armed brokers in human trafficking.
Until the Westo themselves became a liability to the Carolina traders, right? Because the source notes they were destroyed in 1681.
Right, by a combination of white settlers and the Shawnee.
And the Shawnee were also recent immigrants to the area, so they just stepped right in and absorbed that middleman role. It is this cascading mechanical cycle of displacement and enslavement designed purely to funnel capital into Charlestown.
Exactly. And this early period established the foundational capital for the lowcountry elite. I mean, this is where their seed money came from.
Right.
They used the massive profits generated from the Native American slave trade to finance their next economic phase. Because, enslaved Native Americans were risky to hold locally. They possessed intimate knowledge of the geography, making escape highly viable.
Of course. They know the woods.
Right. Whereas West African slaves, violently displaced across an ocean, lacked that geographical advantage entirely. So this cold, brutal calculation initiated the transition in the colony's demographic and economic structure.
And that transition leads directly to the massive commodity crops. The lords proprietors and the local elite realized that, okay, while the native slave trade generates initial capital, long-term scalable wealth requires labor-intensive agriculture.
Yes, the pivot.
So they pivot to two specific crops, rice and indigo.
And rice quickly becomes the primary engine. It was cultivated heavily along the coastal tidal rivers, mainly in the Georgetown and Charleston areas. And it becomes so foundational to the wealth of these planters that it actually earns the moniker Carolina Gold.
Carolina Gold, that's so descriptive.
It is. It references both the visual hue of the unhusked grain and, frankly, its capacity to mint absolute fortunes.
But the mechanics of growing rice in this specific environment, it's incredibly complex. I mean, you don't just clear a field, scatter some seeds, and wait for it to rain.
Oh, no. Not tidal rice. Cultivating tidal rice requires precise hydraulic engineering.
Right.
It requires terraforming on a massive, massive scale. These coastal swamps had to be cleared of ancient cypress trees. And keep in mind, this was all done by hand.
Which is just the sheer physical toll of that is unimaginable.
It is. Then, the land was enclosed by a system of massive earthen dikes and levees just to control the flow of tidal river water. They built intricate networks of irrigation ditches and quarter drains, regulated by these complex wooden sluice gates that they called trunks.
So they were essentially building the 18th century equivalent of a calibrated hydroelectric system, and they were doing it using human calories and hand tools.
Exactly.
The planters themselves actually recognized the scale of this. There's a quote in the source from white planters describing the creation of these water regulation earthworks as an achievement rivaling the works of the ancient Egyptians.
And importantly, the source emphasizes a key point here. The agricultural technology, the complex methods for this tidal rice cultivation, they were patterned on those of West African rice growers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The planters provided the capital and the land, sure, but the actual engineering expertise that made Carolina gold viable, that was imported along with the enslaved workforce from the rice-growing regions of West Africa.
Wow, so the enslaved people were actually the technical experts driving the entire economy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have rice establishing this permanent baseline of extreme wealth, but then we introduce indigo into the equation right around the 1740s.
Right. What's fascinating here is how indigo functions as the perfect complementary crop to rice. In the 1740s, a young woman named Eliza Lucas Pinckney successfully managed the cultivation and processing of indigo in coastal South Carolina.
Eliza Lucas Pinckney.
Yes. And to understand why this was so incredibly lucrative, you have to look at the broader global market. The European textile industry was rapidly expanding right at the onset of industrialization.
Okay.
And because of that, there was a massive demand for cheap dyestuffs to color all this newly manufactured clothing.
And extracting dye from the indigo plant, that is an incredibly volatile chemical process, isn't it? It isn't just like picking a pretty flower and crushing it up.
Far from it, the mechanics of indigo processing were exact and physically punishing.
Oh,
The harvested plants had to be placed in these large steeping vats and covered with water to ferment.
okay.
This fermentation process extracted the indican from the leaves.
Hmm.
But the exact timing was crucial. I mean, too short and you didn't extract enough dye, too long and the chemical composition completely broke down and ruined the batch.
So it's high stakes. And then the fermented liquid was drained into a second vat, right, where it had to be constantly oxygenated.
Yes. And this is where the labor gets truly brutal. Workers had to stand over these vats in the sweltering South Carolina heat, just beating the liquid with wooden paddles
Oh, wow.
to introduce air into the mixture. This caused the dye to precipitate and settle to the bottom as this thick blue sludge. And the smell of rotting, fermenting plant matter under the summer sun was notoriously horrific.
I can't even imagine. It sounded like an absolute nightmare to work in.
It was. The sludge was then drained, boiled, strained, pressed into cakes, and dried. But here is why they did it. The British government desperately wanted a reliable source of this dye within their own empire, so they incentivized it heavily.
Ah, government subsidies.
Exactly. The source details a British bounty of 6 pence per pound for colonial indigo. This triggered a massive indigo bonanza. By the late 1750s, South Carolina was approaching 1 million pounds of indigo annually.
1 million pounds. That is insane. I mean, Carolina planters didn't have a monopoly, and the source notes their indigos sometimes had a mediocre reputation due to inconsistent quality control compared to, say, French or Spanish indigo.
Right, it wasn't always the best quality.
But that British bounty acted as a price floor. It basically guaranteed a return on investment, resulting in this massive influx of capital. It's almost like they were modern venture capitalists who monopolized a booming tech sector, except their disruptive technology was cash crop agriculture built entirely on human exploitation.
That is a very apt analogy. And that resulting wealth dictated every single aspect of the planter class's lifestyle. The era from 1700 to 1770 in the lowcountry was defined by just explosive economic growth.
So what did a day in the life of a lowcountry elite actually look like?
Well, you had a major international harbor in Charleston. You had entrepreneurial businessmen and an incredibly rich physical environment with a long growing season. Though, as the source points out, it was plagued by endemic malaria.
Right, the mosquito issue in the swamps.
Exactly. But if you were one of these elite planters holding the capital from Carolina gold and the indigo bonanza, your consumption habits become completely globalized. The source is very clear that these rich colonials became avid consumers of services from outside the colony.
So they aren't spending locally.
No. They utilized their immense wealth to meticulously mimic the English aristocracy. They were not building local universities or local medical schools during this era. Instead, they exported their capital to purchase global mercantile services.
So they're shipping their kids off to Europe.
Yes, they sent their sons across the Atlantic for medical education at Edinburgh or legal training at the Inns of Court in London. They purchased imported spices, fine textiles, luxury manufactured goods. Everything was imported.
It's wild. Their daily reality was physically located in the humid, malarial swamps of South Carolina, but their economic and cultural anchors were firmly embedded in the high society of London.
Absolutely.
And locally, their interactions were dominated by the acquisition of more land to feed this agricultural machine, right? Like, land was an obsession.
The accumulation of land was a constant operational driver. The market for real estate functioned very efficiently, reflecting this widespread optimism about future economic growth. The overall trend in land sales was rapidly upward, with prices rising in direct parallel to the price of rice.
Supply and demand.
Right. In fact, almost half of all the land sales in the entire colonial period occurred in just the single decade preceding the American Revolution.
Wow, almost half in one decade. That is the metric of a completely overheated market. It is a constant, frenzied expansion, trying to grab the next acre to plant more crops.
Yes, it was a frenzy.
But to expand at that rate, you require a continually expanding labor force. So we really need to look closely at who is actually performing the labor that generated this whole cosmopolitan lifestyle. Because it wasn't always just enslaved Africans, right?
No, the demographics of the labor force shifted dramatically during the early colonial period. In the initial decades, those wealthy Englishmen in the lowcountry relied heavily on white indentured servants.
Let's define the specific mechanics of indentured servitude, because I think people confuse it with slavery, but it was a strictly defined legal contract.
Yes, it was a contract. The bulk of these early laborers were teenage youths from England. They signed a legal document, an indenture, agreeing to work for a specified number of years, typically 4 to 7.
Okay.
And this was to pay off the cost of their transatlantic passage. The operational theory was that they would learn the mechanics of colonial farming, complete their term, and then receive freedom dues,
Which were what, exactly?
often consisting of clothes, tools, and sometimes a small tract of land. The idea was this would allow them to integrate into the independent farming class after their service.
The source also highlights a second, involuntary category of white indentured laborers, which I found fascinating. Scottish Jacobite prisoners of war.
Right, the Jacobites. They were supporters of the exiled House of Stuart, who attempted several rebellions to reclaim the British throne.
Like the whole Outlander situation.
Exactly like that. Following the failed rebellions, particularly the uprising of 1745 that culminated in the Battle of Culloden, the British government captured thousands of these Scottish rebels.
And shipped them over.
Yes. As punishment, many were transported to the colonies and sold into what were essentially lifetime indentures.
So when we look at the social structure of this early period, you've got English youths hoping for a farm, Scottish prisoners of war, enslaved Native Americans, and a growing number of enslaved West Africans all working on these initial plantations. It seems counterintuitive to what we know about the later antebellum South. You would expect immediate, rigid segregation.
You would, but the source notes that in the early colonial years, the social boundaries were surprisingly fluid.
Really?
Yeah, there was considerable interaction and even intermarriage among white indentured laborers, enslaved Native Americans, and enslaved Africans. The rigid, legally codified racial caste system had not yet fully calcified in the 1670s or 1680s.
That's incredible to think about.
The dividing line back then was more often based on property ownership rather than strict racial category.
What? A society with fluid social boundaries doesn't just spontaneously snap into one of the most rigid racial hierarchies in modern history. Usually that requires a massive, terrifying catalyst. And based on the timeline in the source, that catalyst appears to be a combination of shifting English economics and a devastating regional conflict.
You are identifying the exact dual pivot points.
Okay.
First, the economic conditions in England improved substantially toward the end of the 17th century.
So fewer people wanted to leave.
Right. The pool of desperate English youths, willing to sign away years of their lives to work in a malarial swamp, shrank significantly.
Yeah.
The supply line of white indentured servants just began to run dry.
And the tragedy there is that the indentured youths who did come, hoping to learn farming and buy their own land, they basically found themselves marginalized by the wealthy elite as land prices skyrocketed.
Exactly. But the second, much more violent catalyst for the shift to African slavery was the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717.
No, the Yamasee War was a direct consequence of the aggressive Native American trade we discussed earlier, wasn't it? The Yamasee and a broad alliance of other Native groups essentially organized a massive strike against the Carolina traders.
It was driven by systemic abuse. The colonial traders had extended massive amounts of debt to the Native American tribes for manufactured goods and firearms, and they demanded payment in deerskins and enslaved captives.
Right.
But when tribes couldn't pay, traders began seizing the tribe members themselves as payment. This led to a pan-Native American alliance rising up with the explicit goal of wiping the colonial settlement off the map.
The source describes it as an existential conflict. The Yamasee and their allies destroyed outlying plantations and pushed the colonists entirely back into the fortified defenses of Charlestown. They almost succeeded in destroying the colony.
They came very close. The colonists, heavily utilizing armaments from other colonies and eventually turning certain native groups against each other, managed to survive the conflict. But the war fundamentally altered their strategic mindset forever.
How so?
Relying on a local indigenous population for forced labor, or existing closely alongside heavily armed native populations they were actively exploiting, it was deemed a catastrophic security liability.
It makes sense from a brutal strategic standpoint. With the indentured servant pipeline drying up and the native population proving too dangerous to exploit locally, the planters just turned their capital entirely toward importing West African slaves.
Yes, the geographical displacement of African slaves provided the security the planters demanded. They were isolated in a foreign environment with no local allies or geographical knowledge to facilitate escape.
And the scale of this demographic shift was incredibly rapid. By 1708, even before the Yamasee War had fully concluded its impact, but as the shift toward African labor was well underway, African slaves already constituted a majority of the population in the entire colony.
Yes, a black majority.
South Carolina became a black majority colony, a demographic reality that would persist all the way into the 20th century.
And in places like the coastal Sea Islands, you had massive populations of enslaved Africans living and working together in intense isolation, significantly outnumbering the white overseers and planters.
Right.
Out of this extreme concentration, a deeply distinct culture began to emerge, the Gullah Geechee culture.
The development of the Gullah Geechee culture is a profound example of sociological adaptation. Because these large labor camps were relatively isolated from the white population, the enslaved people were able to forge a completely new cultural identity. They developed a creolized language.
And let's break down the mechanics of a Creole language, because it isn't just broken English.
Right. It is a systematic, highly structured linguistic development.
Exactly. The Gullah language utilizes an English vocabulary, which is the superstrate language of the colonizers, but it applies it to the grammatical structures and syntax of various West and Central African languages. Those are the substrate languages.
So it's blending the two in a very specific way.
Right. This allowed enslaved people from entirely different African linguistic backgrounds to communicate effectively with each other while also maintaining a linguistic barrier against the white planters.
That is brilliant. They preserve deep West African traditions and their agricultural practices, their spiritual beliefs, their diet, and their craftsmanship, like the famous sweetgrass basket weaving. It is an incredible testament to human resilience, building a complex, cohesive society within the confines of an absolute labor camp.
It is. However, that resilience combined with the sheer demographic reality of a black majority created a state of perpetual anxiety for the white minority.
I bet. They were outnumbered.
Vastly outnumbered. The core operational challenge for the lowcountry elite was how to control a massive exploited population that could overpower them at any moment. And they managed this through the implementation of absolute, legally codified terror.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean incredibly dark. The turning point for this legal architecture occurred in 1739 with the Stono Rebellion.
Yes, 1739.
A group of enslaved Africans organized an armed uprising near the Stono River. They were attempting to fight their way south to secure freedom in Spanish Florida, right? Because the Spanish had offered asylum specifically to destabilize the English colony.
That's right. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed by the colonial militia, but it confirmed the planters' absolute greatest fear.
The nightmare scenario.
Exactly. In direct, immediate response, the colonial elite under Governor William Bull drafted and passed the Comprehensive Negro Act of 1740.
The Negro Act of 1740.
This legislation was the mechanism that finalized the social hierarchy. It stripped away any lingering fluidity from the early colonial era and defined every single physical interaction through a strict racial caste.
Looking at the specific statutes of the Negro Act reveals exactly how the colonial elite sought to eliminate the logistical capacity for organization. They didn't just increase punishments, they targeted the specific mechanics of daily autonomy.
They did. The act made it illegal for enslaved Africans to move abroad without explicit written permission from their owner.
The pass.
Right. This pass system was designed to stop the free flow of information and physically isolate the labor force on their respective plantations. It also made it illegal for them to assemble in groups, completely neutralizing their ability to organize socially or politically.
It also targeted economic autonomy. It became illegal for enslaved people to raise their own food independently or to earn and keep their own money. This ensured complete material dependence on the planter. You couldn't buy your way out, and you couldn't survive on your own.
Furthermore, it specifically targeted intellectual empowerment by making it illegal to teach an enslaved person to write.
Now, this is a fascinating mechanical detail in the law. The source specifically notes that teaching them to write was outlawed, but reading was not explicitly prescribed.
Right.
If you're designing a system of absolute control, why leave a loophole for reading? That seems like an oversight.
Well, the prevailing theory among historians is twofold. First, the religious motivations of some colonists dictated that enslaved people should be able to read the Bible for Christian salvation.
Okay, that makes sense for the time period.
Second, and much more practically, writing is the mechanism of forgery.
Ah, the travel passes.
Exactly. If an enslaved person could write, they could forge the written travel passes required by the act, allowing them to move freely and organize rebellions across large distances. Banning writing was a highly strategic security measure.
Wow, that is incredibly calculated. And the ultimate enforcement mechanism of the act was absolute. It legally permitted owners to kill rebellious slaves if necessary. It gave the white minority the power of life and death, backed entirely by the state apparatus over the majority of the colony's population. And the source notes this legal architecture remained fundamentally in effect until 1865.
125 years.
Yeah.
When you synthesize these elements, you see the daily reality of the lowcountry perfectly.
Yeah.
The planter's reality was managing this system of systemic coercion to ensure the agricultural machine produced the capital required for their cosmopolitan consumption.
Right, maintaining the velvet ballroom.
Exactly. And the enslaved person's reality was defined by exhaustive physical labor within a highly engineered agricultural landscape, restricted by a legal framework designed to monitor and control every physical movement.
It is a society wound incredibly tight, functioning smoothly only through the application of immense force. But this highly structured, immensely wealthy coastal society is only half of the South Carolina blueprint.
Yes, we have to look inland.
Because while the lowcountry elite are managing global trade and enforcing the Negro Act, an entirely different demographic is filtering into the interior of the colony.
We shift our focus geographically to the upcountry, or the Piedmont region. This area was settled significantly later, primarily in the mid to late 18th century.
So good 50 to 80 years after Charlestown?
Right. And the environmental mechanics here dictate a completely different way of life. It is defined by hilly, upland terrain, dense woods, and rocky soil. It completely lacks the broad tidal rivers that made the coastal rice terraforming possible.
And the people migrating into this environment arrived through a completely different logistical pipeline than the English aristocrats of Charlestown, didn't they?
They did. The population of the backcountry was primarily composed of Scots, Irish, and North British migrants. These were people originating from Ulster, the Scottish lowlands, and the border counties of northern England.
Okay.
Crucially, they did not arrive by sailing directly into Charleston Harbor with massive capital to invest.
So how did they get there?
They took the overland route. Most of them had originally immigrated to northern ports like Philadelphia or Chester in Pennsylvania. Over decades, as land in Pennsylvania became too expensive or simply too crowded, these families slowly migrated south down what was called the Great Wagon Road.
The Great Wagon Road.
Yeah, it was a massive inland trail stretching from Pennsylvania down through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and eventually filtering right into the Carolina Piedmont.
The source notes they arrived in continuous waves, particularly a large influx in the 1750s and 60s, consisting of second and third generation Scotch-Irish Americans. They brought with them large families and a deeply ingrained cultural disposition suited for the frontier.
And to understand their daily reality, we really have to look at the mechanics of subsistence farming in an undeveloped forest.
Right, because they weren't planting massive fields of commodity crops for export.
No, not at all. They operated on pure subsistence. The daily grind consisted of girdling trees, which is cutting a ring around the bark to kill the tree so sunlight could finally reach the forest floor, and then planting corn, beans, and squash in the rocky dirt right between the dead timber.
Back-breaking work.
It was. They hunted local game, they built their own cabins from the timber they felled, they produced goods strictly for their own consumption, and perhaps minor bartering with immediate neighbors.
The soil and the climate simply did not support the kind of large-scale commodity agriculture seen on the coast. But even if the environment had been perfect for rice or indigo, they lacked the capital. The source is explicit. the backcountry settlers were overwhelmingly non-slaveholding and fundamentally poor.
Yes, we're talking about a later stream of immigrants who, even when arriving directly from Northern Ireland via Charleston just prior to the Revolution, were so financially depleted they settled in the most undeveloped fringe areas simply because they couldn't afford the rapidly rising price of land in the lowcountry.
Wait, so let me challenge the narrative here for a second. We have these super wealthy aristocrats on the coast, sipping imported wine, reading London legal texts, and just a few dozen miles inland, it's essentially a frontier survivalist camp.
Pretty much.
How did these two groups even exist in the same colony without just tearing each other apart?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really explains the cultural clash. The source references historian David Hackett Fisher, noting that the backcountry possessed a culture perfectly matched to the British borderlands.
The borderlands, meaning the border between England and Scotland.
Exactly. Historically, those border regions were zones of constant conflict, violence, and weak centralized authority. The people who migrated from those regions developed a culture that was fiercely independent, clannish, and deeply suspicious of distant aristocratic governments.
I see. So when these Scots-Irish settlers looked toward Charlestown, they didn't see fellow colonial pioneers building a new world together.
Not at all.
They saw the exact same wealthy, heavily centralized, snooty English authority figures their ancestors had specifically migrated across an ocean to avoid.
Precisely. And the sentiment was entirely mutual. The coastal planters looked inland and perceived an uncouth, uneducated, and potentially dangerous population.
They looked down on them completely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because of the vast differences in background, class, slaveholding status, economic function, and culture, there was a deeply rooted, long-standing tension between the lowcountry and the backcountry.
Geographically, I suppose, the sheer difficulty of travel through the swamps and dense forests kept them isolated enough to avoid daily social friction. You couldn't just pop over for a visit.
Right, the distance helped.
But politically, they were bound within the exact same governmental framework. And the mechanics of that political system were designed explicitly to benefit only one side of the divide.
And this is where the powder keg gets lit. The political architecture of colonial South Carolina was structured as monopoly. The lowcountry planters hoarded all political representation within the colonial assembly located in Charlestown.
Of course they did.
They apportioned legislative seats to ensure that their wealth and their agricultural interests maintained absolute control over the colony's laws and budget.
Meanwhile, the backcountry population was exploding. Thousands of new settlers were pouring down the Great Wagon Road, creating these massive new communities in the interior. Yet this huge demographic shift was granted virtually zero political representation in the assembly.
It was a structural imbalance that guaranteed conflict. The coastal elite were making all the rules, setting all the tax policies, and completely ignoring the daily realities of the subsistence farmers.
And the primary catalyst for the impending conflict wasn't just an abstract philosophical desire for voting rights, was it? It was a desperate need for basic physical security and infrastructure.
Yes. Let's examine the reality of taxation without services. The backcountry citizens were required to pay taxes to the colonial government in Charlestown, but the government provided absolutely nothing in return.
Nothing.
Nothing. There were no courts, no judges, no sheriffs, no jails, and no formalized law enforcement in the interior.
When you have a rapidly expanding frontier population existing in a total judicial vacuum, the inevitable result is organized crime.
Oh, rampant crime. Outlaw gangs began operating with impunity across the Piedmont. They terrorized the isolated homesteads, stealing horses and livestock, burning cabins, assaulting settlers, kidnapping individuals.
Imagine the mechanical reality of this situation for a second. You have spent 3 years felling pine trees to build a cabin, planting corn between stumps, barely surviving, and paying taxes to a distant city.
Right.
Then a gang rides up, steals your only plow horse, and assaults your family. The nearest judge is 200 miles away through an undeveloped swamp, and the government in Charlestown just flat out refuses to send a sheriff because they don't want to spend tax revenue on infrastructure for people they consider unwashed rabble.
It is infuriating. And the government's refusal to act forced the backcountry settlers to develop their own mechanical solution. In the 1760s, this frustration coalesced into the regulator movement.
The regulators. I love this part.
Local leaders in these terrorized areas organized their communities into armed citizen patrols.
The regulators are such a fascinating study in frontier vigilantism
Alone.
because they didn't just ride out as a disorganized mob with pitchforks. They systematically organized themselves to perform the functions the colonial government had abandoned.
Yes, they were highly structured.
They hunted down the outlaw gangs, utilizing their own military experience from frontier militias.
But their actions extended beyond simple posse enforcement. They established a parallel system of governance. They drafted agreements, sometimes called plans of regulation. They set up their own tribunals to try accused criminals. They administered punishments, frequently utilizing public whipping posts, and they managed local civic affairs.
They were actively building the state infrastructure that Charlestown refused to provide. And the Colonial Assembly was terrified, weren't they?
Terrified, the coastal elite viewed the regulators not as citizens demanding basic services, but as an armed insurrection threatening the established order of the entire colony.
It's the classic dynamic. The interior factory floor was essentially threatening to march on the corporate headquarters.
Exactly. And this raises an important question about the nature of colonial rebellion. We frequently focus on 1776 and the colonial rebellion against King George III. But years prior to rebelling against the British Crown, the citizens of South Carolina were effectively staging an armed rebellion against their own local aristocratic elites.
Wow, I never thought about it like that.
The regulators represented a massive pressure campaign, utilizing the threat of organized violence to force political change from within.
And the pressure mechanics worked. The sheer organizational capacity and the armed numbers of the regulators proved too significant to ignore.
They did. In 1769, the royal governor and the elected assembly in Charlestown finally yielded to the reality on the ground. They passed the Circuit Court Act, which agreed to the fundamental demands of the backcountry.
Okay, so they finally got their infrastructure.
Yes. The legislation provided the funding and the legal framework to construct courthouses, establish jails, and appoint sheriffs for newly created judicial districts in the interior.
And once the mechanical infrastructure of a justice system was in place, the regulators largely disbanded, right? Because they hadn't set out to overthrow the government. They simply utilized armed organization to force the government to fulfill its basic social contract.
Right. They just wanted the system to work for them, too.
It proved that organized pressure from a marginalized social stratum could force an entrenched wealthy elite to concede structural power.
However, the passage of the Circuit Court Act in 1769 did not erase the underlying cultural and economic fault lines. The deep-seated animosity between the cosmopolitan, slaveholding coast and the rugged subsistence farming interior was permanently encoded into the political DNA of South Carolina.
So when we analyze all of this source material, what does it actually reveal about the nature of this society? Why is understanding a 300-year-old social hierarchy matter for you listening today?
Well, colonial South Carolina functions as a masterclass in how economic systems physically construct the boundaries of a society. The source material strips away the mythology of a unified colonial experience and exposes the raw mechanics of human organization under extreme economic incentives.
Your daily life, your physical security, your mobility, and your legal rights were not inherent simply because you were a quote-unquote colonist. They were dictated entirely by your social status and your specific relationship to the economic engine.
Exactly. Let's recap. If you were a member of the planter elite, your status granted you a globalized existence. You utilized the capital generated by forced labor to purchase the trappings of European aristocracy, and you utilized your political monopoly to construct a legal framework that protected your property and insulated you from the consequences of the inequality you engineered.
But if you were a white indentured servant, your daily reality was defined by a legally binding contract, exchanging years of physical labor in a hazardous environment for the theoretical opportunity to eventually participate in the land-owning class, subject entirely, of course, to the economic whims of the planters.
And if you were an enslaved African, you were the foundational kinetic energy of the entire economy, yet you lived under the absolute, omnipresent jurisdiction of the 1740 Negro Act.
The worst reality imaginable.
Yes. Your reality was defined by staggering terraforming labor, while the legal architecture was designed specifically to monitor your movements, prevent your education, and suppress your autonomy through the legally sanctioned threat of lethal violence.
And finally, if you were a backcountry subsistence farmer, you existed on the absolute fringe of the system. You survived through intense physical endurance in a borderlands culture, largely ignored and despised by the centralized government that collected your taxes, until you finally organized a paramilitary force to demand basic civic infrastructure.
It is crucial to maintain an objective perspective on this data, as the sources do. The sources are not injecting modern morality into the historical record. They are impartially documenting the blueprint of a highly unequal, highly volatile colonial machine.
Right.
It was a system that functioned with ruthless efficiency to generate massive wealth for a tiny minority, but it was deeply fractured in its social cohesion.
The tensions between the coast and the interior, between the enslaved majority and the enslavers, between the impoverished borderland migrants and the English aristocrats, these were massive structural fault lines constantly grinding against each other.
Which presents a final, highly complex logistical puzzle regarding the subsequent history of this region.
Oh.
Think about it. We universally picture the American Revolution through a specific narrative, right? A united front of patriotic colonists locking arms to depose the tyranny of the British Empire.
Right, a unified fight for universal liberty.
Yeah.
Paul Revere, the whole thing.
But apply the mechanics of everything we have just analyzed to that narrative. Consider the intense, structurally ingrained hostility between the wealthy lowcountry planters and the fiercely independent backcountry farmers. The source data explicitly notes that South Carolina possessed one of the strongest loyalist factions of any colony. Approximately 5,000 men took up arms against the Patriot government. And geographically, this loyalist support was heavily concentrated in the backcountry.
Wait, really? The backcountry supported the British?
Yes, entire settlements either actively supported the British or aggressively refused to align with the Patriot cause.
So, when the Revolutionary War shifted to the Southern Theater and the British Army marched into South Carolina, the mechanics of the conflict changed entirely. How much of the fighting in the Carolina Pines was actually driven by philosophical debates over taxation without representation by Parliament? And how much of it was simply a violent, opportunistic civil war erupting along the exact fault lines we've discussed today?
It forces a complete reevaluation of the conflict's internal dynamics. Were backcountry farmers fighting to maintain the authority of King George? Or were they utilizing the chaos of an imperial war to finally open fire on the Charlestown elites they had despised for 3 generations?
Man, that is a wild thought.
The revolution in the South was not just a war for imperial independence. It was a violent, chaotic reckoning of the profound internal hierarchies established over the preceding century.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex, layered, and strictly partitioned reality of colonial daily life. Next time you encounter a generalized narrative of the colonial era, remember to look at the mechanics beneath the surface. The reality was defined by the vast, highly engineered expanse between a velvet masquerade ball on the coast and a desperate, armed family surviving in the pines. Keep exploring, keep questioning the mechanics of history, and we'll see you next time.